Good evening. All spiritual healing depends on the degree of evolved or developed spiritual consciousness that you or your practitioner have. In other words, if you were to present yourself to the medical thought and you were examined, the medical thought, working through the 5 physical senses, says you have a cold and aspirin will take care of that for you. Now, to the medical sense, you are a physical body, and in this day they go further and acknowledge that you have a mind, and that mind may have something to do with your body. And therefore, if you have the right mental attitude and some aspirin, you are going to be made well. Now this is right. This is as it should be, because on the material and mental level of life, there must be the remedies for the discords of sense. And this is the way it is done. When you present yourself to a spiritual healer, they do not examine your mind or your body. Why? They have arrived at a state of evolved and developed consciousness that enables them to look through the appearance and see you as you are. Spiritual, not only you, this entire universe, including your body. And because of their evolved spiritual consciousness and you're making yourself one with it, you respond to that. You are lifted up above the 5 physical senses and you respond to that higher consciousness. In other words, the Son of God, the Christ that Peter discerned in Jesus, is lifted up in you, and material sense drops away, and with it the false images of the physical sense, which we call disease, illness, lack, anything. Now, to the evolved and developed spiritual consciousness, you are not seen as a human being made up partly of good and partly of bad, partly of mind and partly of matter. You are not seen in that light at all. The evolved spiritual consciousness is not looking at your body. They are not looking at your mind. They are communing with you. They know you. I know thee who thou art. Thou art the child of God. In other words, wherever there is an evolved spiritual awareness, there is the discernment of your true being, your true nature, and it is for this reason that when healing is at the spiritual level, it is without effort. There are no long drawn-out treatments. There is no such thing as an imposed mental activity. No such thing, for instance, as, oh, you are spiritual, or you are perfect, and you are God's perfect child. No, what do you call it? It isn't hypnotism, but suggestion. No suggestions are thrown at you. No suggestions are aimed at you for the purpose of convincing you or changing your state of mind. The spiritual consciousness does not take you into consideration, for there is no you separate and apart from God and God's spiritual kingdom. Therefore, the evolved or developed spiritual consciousness is not thinking of treating you or healing you. It is you who are reaching this consciousness and asking for help. But this consciousness is only realizing spiritual being, spiritual God, one infinite being, infinitely manifested, and has evolved to that place where it ignores the appearances of the five physical senses. It ignores, this evolved or developed spiritual consciousness or person ignores the appearance. Now, be assured you could get in trouble having these appearances ignored by those who might be using the words without having the consciousness to back it up. Because the words themselves will heal nobody. The words themselves will do nothing. It is the consciousness behind this that does it. And that consciousness must, in its spiritual discernment, have seen this. There are not two powers. God being infinite, spirit is omnipotence. Therefore, we do not have two powers. We don't have a battle. We don't have anything to overcome. We don't have anything to rise above. All we have in spiritual consciousness is this realization. God is. There's no other power. There's no other presence. There's no other being. There's no other law. Then you find that the law of infection, the law of contagion, the law of accident does not operate. The miracle part of this is this. Nobody knows how spiritual healing takes place. Nobody knows in any one particular case how you're going to work on a particular case, if you are. And no one knows what the results are going to be or when. It is a constant living in this awareness of God as individual being. That is your first major principle in the infinite way. God is individual being. God is manifest as individual you. God is incarnated as individual you. And this spiritual consciousness lives in that awareness, not merely when you ask for help. It has to be a 24-hour-a-day realization. In the same way, you can't turn on and off a statement that God is the only power. You live in that consciousness continuously, so that no matter how many times other powers are presented to you, they just do not register. You're living always in this consciousness of God, Spirit, as the only power. And then these other things take place. For instance, on our last trip to California, or just before I left Hawaii for that trip, I had an unfoldment one day that came to me in relationship to the claim of cancer. I don't know why. I wasn't working on that particular claim or thinking of it. It just was one of those things that came. And in my first week in California, I had 3 calls from those who were in the last stages where they had been given up. And we had 3 instantaneous healings. Now, it wasn't anything I did. It wasn't anything special I knew. It was that consciousness, and they hit up against it. In fact, I have a letter this week in the mail from one of those 3 cases saying that the doctors claim that this is one of only 5 cases recorded in medical history of this nature. One of only 5. And yet, it wasn't done in such a way that I could say I take credit for it or I can guarantee to do it for you the next time. Nothing like that. I'm only bringing it out to show you that it is the consciousness in which you are that determines the nature and the degree of the healing. And if you are in this uplifted consciousness where you are not seeing man whose breath is in his nostril, even though the physical eyes see him, you are disregarding that because you know what's behind it, just like the musician is not looking at notes or even hearing notes. They're hearing music. So, in spiritual consciousness, even though there may be human beings in front of you, you are not living with them, thinking of them in those terms. You have seen them. You've experienced them. You've tabernacled with them. You've communed with them as consciousness. And then because they have attuned themselves to you, they respond to that consciousness. So it is that the degree of your reading or hearing the Word, that is the measure of this consciousness that ultimately evolves. If you were born with an evolved spiritual consciousness, these processes would not be necessary. You would not have to read books. You would not have to hear tapes or go to classes. This consciousness, if it had evolved from within naturally, would keep you there always, and you'd be a natural healer without having developed this consciousness. But there isn't 1 in a million of those. We evolve from our human state, the state in which we were born, the natural man. We evolve through our studies, reading, hearing, practicing, until we attain some measure of this higher consciousness. And so, tonight I would like to give you this. The class this week has more or less been on the subject of our real self or spiritual self and the natural man. And now, so that the whole subject will be clarified, I'm going to explain that in this way. First, let us agree. If you or I think or do anything of an erroneous nature, we know it, and very quickly we sit in judgment on ourselves because we know it, and as rapidly as possible, we try to make amends or to see that it's not repeated. Except for the wholly animal individual, and there are such on earth. This is true. There are some so completely animalistic that they have no awareness at all of wrongdoing. It would make no difference if they pulled the whole world down around their shoulders. They would have no sense that they had done anything wrong. It would probably be our fault and we made them do it. There are those who could wreck a company or wreck a bank or wreck a nation and not have the slightest twinge of conscience, because they have no sense of wrongdoing whatsoever. They are living wholly on the animal level of life, and nothing matters to them except me. I, me, and mine. That is the law of self-preservation being the first law of nature. And nothing else matters, and whatever evil they do, somehow or other, it's always our fault. But as you know from your own experience, there are not many. There are some in lesser degree, but there are not too many. The average person has what is called a conscience. And first of all, it prevents them doing too much wrong, except under provocation. And in most cases, actually, it doesn't even permit us to do a slight wrong without knowing of it and trying to correct it. Now, listen. The reason for this is that we are spiritual beings. We are the Christ. We are the Son of God, the emanation of God, and we have in us the mind of Christ Jesus. We are perfect. Paul, in describing this, says, I do not sin, but I still find a sense of sin in me. Now, this is the truth about every one of us. We do not sin, but nevertheless, a temptation arises here and there to think or do something erroneous, and sometimes we do, sometimes we succeed in meeting the temptation. Not because we are evil, not because there is any evil in us, but because, having been born into this belief in two powers, this sense of sin, this sense of self, this sense of materiality, this sense of self-preservation operates in us. And therefore, even though we know better, we sometimes do wrong or think wrong. All right. The point that I want to make is this. It is not because there is a you that has a good side and a bad side. It is because you are the Christ self. You are the real man. You are the child of God. You are perfection. And anything less than that isn't you, and that's why you can recognize it and want to overcome it, want to get rid of it. That is why you want to lose sensuality over appetites or under appetites or erroneous appetites. That is the reason, because you, in your true identity, you yourself are that spiritual sense. Now, in Christian mysticism, we have the term Christ consciousness, or that mind which was in Christ Jesus. In Oriental mysticism, we have the Buddha mind. In Christian mysticism, we have the Christ. In Oriental mysticism, we have the Buddha. And let me explain this. The Christ is yourself. The Buddha is yourself. The Buddha and the Christ mean the same thing. It means the illumined. And you are the illumined self. The Buddha is the illumined self. The Christ is the illumined self. And you are the Christ. You are the Buddha. You are the illumined self. You do not get the mind that was in Christ Jesus. You are the mind that was in Christ Jesus. You do not get the Buddha mind. You are the Buddha mind. But alongside of that, you have this material or finite sense. And it is this that the Master says he has overcome. He has overcome this world, that is, the mortal sense of world in himself. In Chinese mysticism, they show you this in another way. If you ever see a figure of Lao Tzu sitting backwards on a horse, you will see how it is presented. In Chinese mysticism, a horse represents the 5 physical senses. Well, when you aren't in control, you better sit the right way and have a hold of the reins. When you have attained mastery over the senses, you can sit backwards on horse and not even touch the reins. And the horse cannot run away with you. You don't have to touch the reins. You don't have to look at them. You are the master, and the horse knows it. So it is, while we are evolving as students, we have to watch our lower nature. We have to hold the reins on it. We have to resist temptation. We have to affirm truths. We have to have Bible passages to hold us to the fact that there is a He within us. After we have come into the awareness of ourselves as the Christ mind, all that's gone. The battle is over. There are no more temptations. You are living as spiritual being because you are seeing everyone else as spiritual being, and now you have no capacity to do other than to do unto others as you would have them do to you, because as far as you're concerned, the other is you, and you are the other, and anything that you would do to another for good or evil, you are doing unto yourself. Now you can dispense with your bridge, you can dispense with your raft, because you are now there on the other side. How do we come to this evolved sense? While the letter of truth is a tremendous help, and as a matter of fact, it is a necessary help. I haven't yet discovered a way of dispensing with it. But it is only a help to help us into meditation where the real transition exists. This, incidentally, is what sets apart the entire message of the Infinite Way, that while truth is universal, I recognize, and the Infinite Way message recognizes, that you could know all the truth there is from here to Jerusalem and back again. And if you do not attain the realization of your real self, knowing that truth is going to play a small part in your life, you must eventually reach the realization of your real self. my real self, your real self, his real self, until there is only one real self. And this is done through the meditation. Now, it is in meditation where we make that final contact with our source, with the spiritual source of existence, that enables us to know the truth not intellectually, but through realization. You see, we have had the lesson this week about the hidden manna, showing this hidden manna in many, many different forms. The eye of our being, the meat, the wine, the bread, the resurrection, the I that I am. Now, this I that I am is the Christ self. But it is not only the self of me, it is the self of you. It's a universal self. It isn't an individual self that I alone have. It's a universal sense that is I and is I you. I make contact with this I. I have made contact with the universal self which I am, but I have made contact with you. Not with your humanhood, but with your spiritual identity. We are then, well, as the Master says, I no longer call you servants, but friends. In other words, the moment I recognize that this Christ self of me is the Christ self of you, we are equal, and that's the only equality there is. There is no such thing as an equality of social status. There's no such thing as an equality of even political status. All you have to do is belong to a political party and find out what I mean. There is no such thing as equality of economic status. There is the poor and the rich and the in-between. There is the socially up and the socially down, the socially somebody, socially nobody. There is the commercial up and the commercial down. There's no such thing as equality in human life. And there never can be. There is only a spiritual equality. And that equality is because my self is your self. It's only the one self. That's why we are equal. We may still each have our different economic levels of life to live in. We may still have our different political levels, our social levels. There's no equality there, and let's not look for it. Let's each remain unto ourselves and keep progressing. But the point is that spiritually, even the least of these is my equal. And even the greatest of these is only equal with me. Why? Because there is but one self. It is divine. Now, in proportion as I know that, when this natural man of me wants to express himself in some form or other, because I have realized my true self, I can say, "Get thee behind me, Satan. I'm not interested in you." It may appear to me as fear, and I can turn on it and say, what's the use of fearing when I'm eternal? Neither life nor death can separate me from God. And that eliminates the fear. No matter what temptation would come, because of my recognition of my true identity, of my real self, I can always say to the natural man of me, whatever amount of it's left, and be assured that in everyone there is some left. No one has ever yet attained full Christhood while on earth. Even the Master could say to the disciples, "Why do you not pray with me? Could you not stay awake with me?" There's enough of that natural man that wants to keep the status quo. But the point is that in proportion as I realize that Christ is my true nature, is my true identity, in that degree, when the natural man wants to rise up in sin or sickness or lack or any other claim, I can turn on it and say, there's no reality to you. I know who I am. I am the Son of God, heir of God, joint heir, and I can hold myself up here in that consciousness of my true identity, and then the natural man recedes. And so it is, the higher we go in the awareness of the truth, that the Buddha nature is my true nature, the Christ nature is my true nature, the Christ consciousness is my true consciousness, the Christ life is my true life, divine sonship is my real being, in the degree that I know that about me and am willing to acknowledge it about you. In that degree, then, the natural man of me has less play in my life, less influence, less occasion. He may rise up with temptations, and does, but always up here there is this remembrance of my true identity. Now you will find in all of the religious literature of the world, more especially the mystical, that the goal is the awareness of your true identity. The Greeks say, "Man, know thyself." Come to know your own true identity. The whole of the Christian mysticism or the Master's teaching is the same thing. Know ye not, ye are the temple of the living God? The whole thing is telling you your true identity. You are the child of God. You are children of God. You are the temple of God. The Master is always revealing to you your true identity, and then showing you that the carnal man, the mortal man, the natural man is not of God and must be put off. Put off the old man. Put off immortality and put on immortality. He's always showing you these two. The lower self, the natural man, and the higher self, which I am, Christ. Who do ye say that I am? And unless you can say Christ, you are not rising in spiritual consciousness. You haven't attained enough spiritual awareness to discern, to see me as I am. And if I am not in the position at all times, even if you don't know your true identity, if I can't remember it up here, then in that degree am I not living in my spiritual consciousness, as spiritual consciousness. So you see that good is really not a quality that you are going to attain. Good is the being that you are. Christ is not something you are going to attain. Christ is the being which you are. Buddhahood, or the Buddha mind, is not something you are going to attain. It is something which you are, but which you are now to realize. You are to realize that Christ is your true identity. You don't gain it. There is no you to gain something. There is the you which already is, but which must now be realized. Now, the more you dwell consciously, again, you hear the Master, if you abide in this word, if you let me abide in you, if you let me abide in you, what does that mean? If you understand Christ as your identity, that's letting Christ abide in you. Not really in you, but as you. If you will let Christ abide, dwell as you, if you will dwell as Christ, and then when your lower self, the carnal man, the natural man, rises up to say, I don't feel well, I'm sick, or I'm poor, or I'm tempted, or I'm sinning, put him down. Get thee behind me, Satan. I know who I am. And you'll find gradually it becomes easier and easier and easier, not only to attain life as the child of God, but also, what is so very important, to live with your neighbors, knowing their true identity, even those who haven't even begun to suspect it. Now, here is where the most wonderful thing happens. The Christ does not have to earn its living by the sweat of the brow. The Christ does not have to struggle or strive. The Christ lives by grace, heir of God, joint heir to all the heavenly riches. And that is what happens in the moment that you recognize your identity and mine. It must be universal, remember. The moment you realize that we are living not as mortals, as Christ being, in the degree that that begins to register with you, your life loses the battle. It loses the struggle. It begins to, your good begins to appear by grace. Not by might nor by power, but by grace, by the Spirit of God that dwells in you, without taking thought for your life. But all of this can only happen in proportion as you begin to recognize your true identity, your Christhood, that I live as Christ. My true identity is Christhood. The mind of Christ is my mind. The soul of God is my soul. I and my Father are one, and all of the spiritual qualities are mine. The more you live with that, the more you are meditating within, and then in that inner stillness and peace, the click comes. That which happened to Moses when he could say, oh, I am that I am. I've been seeking another. I am. Or when Jesus had that same realization, which was the foundation of his whole ministry. I am that I am. I am the me. Thou seest me, thou seest the Father that sent me, for I and the Father are one. See, in that recognition, he knew that he didn't have to heal anybody, because they also were the same Christ where there were no evil powers, no negative powers. And so his mighty works were done. And he lived his life by grace. He lived his life by grace because he lived as Jesus the Christ. Jesus the Christ. The moment you live as Joel the Christ, John the Christ, Mary the Christ, and then live up there. Don't make a liar of yourself day in and day out. Don't make that claim and then turn around and act contrary to it. Don't do that. Once you put on the robe, once you claim the name of Christ, get up there and live up there. If you have to pluck out an eye, pluck it out. If you have to pluck off a hand, pluck it off. Rather than surrender yourself and go back to being man whose breath is in his nostril, rather than go back and be the carnal man. Once you've recognized Christ as your identity, it is the equivalent of putting on the robe. The robe isn't a physical thing. The robe is the spirit of Christ. The robe is the consciousness of Christ. When you put that on, live up to it. You won't live up to it 100%. No one can. But don't use that as an excuse to grovel in the dirt. Be up there to the very highest of your capacity and stay there. Because this is divine sonship. The Son of God is only raised up in you when you acknowledge that you are He. The Son of God is only raised up in you when you realize the Son of God is your true identity. Now, once you realize this, and of course you know, of course, that you dare not breathe this to a living soul. That would be a sin beyond all sins, ever to voice a thing like this, except in the sanctity of those of your own spiritual household. In other words, when you're imparting it in a class or when you're meeting together with those of your own study group, and then only being sure that they've risen high enough to know it also. The safest thing is not to mention it at all. Live with it internally, and anyone who wants to observe it outwardly, that's all right. If someone wants to acknowledge, oh, you have something, if someone wants to acknowledge, oh, you are different, that's well, but don't you claim it. And don't tell them that they are it either. Because this cannot be told to anyone except in proportion as they have been raised up to receive it. Otherwise, they can't hear it even when you voice it. But there is enough animal nature in the human, they would love to prove to you that it isn't so and turn and rend you. And the Master warns you of that. The Master warns you of that. Don't give your pearls to the swine. Don't cast your spiritual wisdom to the unillumined thought. They'll turn and rend you. Now, these are things that are spoken only in the sanctity of the classroom. And that is why a classroom always should be held as a sacred place, because things are apt to be said that have no right to be published. That is why, insofar as is possible, we should never try to bring anyone into a classroom except someone that we know is earnestly seeking the truth of their own identity, or the truth of being, or the truth of spiritual things. It isn't a difficult thing to have large classes. The difficult thing is to have classes made up of those who are consecrated to spiritual study, dedicated to spiritual study. That's difficult because you are pruning. It's legitimate to seek loaves and fishes, but not in a classroom of this nature. There are lots of ways of leading up to it. And so it is that should you ever feel called upon to recommend to anyone one of our classes, please don't feel you're doing anybody a favor by recommending anyone except those whom you feel are spiritually dedicated. Because the object of these classes isn't just to have large numbers and large dollars. The object is to find those eager to meet together for a period of time, to tabernacle with truth, to be in the conscious presence of God, to learn the nature of our true identity, and to be able to go out and heal the sick, to be able to go out and help establish peace on earth through the realization of our true identity. You know, the more you recognize Christ as the identity of every individual, the less capacity they have left for being animalistic. And that is what, in this age, is changing a great measure of the world. The fact that many who would love to be remaining in their animal nature are having the capacity to be animalistic taken away from them by those who are seeing spiritually the true nature of man. Now, you are a spiritual being, and you have a spiritual incorporeal body, and this is so true that when the day comes that you depart this plane through what the world calls death, be assured you will be carrying your body with you. That which the others see behind represents the material sense of body that evolves out of the five physical sense mind. But be assured you won't be without a body. It's impossible for anything to be disembodied or unembodied. Everything there is, even a thought, has body. And there is such a thing as an incorporeal body. And that's the body that is yours. If it weren't for that, no spiritual healing could ever take place at any level. It is only because your body is incorporeal and it is spiritual, even though to some degree we are all entertaining material concepts of body, a material sense of body. But in the degree that this material sense of body lessens, in that degree does your body show forth less of the limitations of the material body. In other words, it is for this reason that we have so many wonderful examples of people who have reached 75 and 80 and 85 and 90 and 95 and who are not decrepit and who are not deaf, dumb, and blind. It is for this reason that in the degree that they catch the nature of their true identity, their body is no longer under the law of matter, but under grace. And when the body is under grace, it should be able to maintain its status as long as you have need for it. When you no longer have need for it, you step out of it. And this we call the transition. And so you know that we gained our material sense of body through our five physical senses, all of which have been built because of the Adamic belief in two powers, the good and the evil. And you lose this material sense of body in proportion as you realize God as infinite spirit, the substance, law, and activity of the whole universe, including the body. I myself, this is you speaking, I myself am the Christ self, the Buddha self, the spiritual self. I myself am the real man, the spiritual man, the Son of God. And all that the Father hath is mine, all of the divine qualities, all of the divine nature, all of the divine being. This is the truth about me. Now, the natural man of me comes along and says, but. And then that's when you, in your higher recognition, must turn and say, get thee behind me, Satan. I know all about the claims of Satan. I know all about the claims of the carnal man or of the natural man. But I stand on my dignity, on the dignity of my true nature, of my true being. I know who I am. Do you see that? Then in that proportion, you are meditating. This is meditation. It is contemplative meditation, and it leads to an inner stillness and quiet And then sometime when you're not thinking at all, when you're not even thinking of meditating, all of a sudden the truth will pop up. Knowest thou not, thou art the Christ of God. Knowest thou not, thou art the temple of God. And you look up who spoke. Who spoke? It was the still small voice. You brought yourself to an inner stillness where you could hear the still small voice by this continued realization of your true identity. You see, 1,000 shall fall at thy left and 10,000 at thy right of those who do not dwell in this truth. Do you see that if you do not abide in this truth, if you do not let this truth abide in you, if you do not recognize the Christ as your true identity, if you do not let me, Christ, abide as you, you will be as a branch of a tree that is cut off and withers and dies. But if you live consciously in the realization of Christ, let the Christ dwell in you as yourself, you will bear fruit richly. Spiritual fruitage, because all that the Father hath is yours. As Christ, as the Son of God, as heir of God. All that the Father hath is yours. You will bear fruit richly. But you must let me, the Christ, dwell as you, within you. So whether you call it, as Paul did, the Christ that dwelleth in me, or whether you use the word as we do in the infinite way, the Christ that dwelleth as me, you are letting, at any rate, you are letting the Christ dwell in you. And if you do, you will bear fruit richly. Christ is your true identity. Divine sonship is your relationship to God. The more you abide in this truth and let this truth abide in you, the more it will be so unto you. The less that you let it occupy your consciousness, the less spiritual grace you will know. Whether you say Christ in the midst of me is mighty, or whether you say I in the midst of me is mighty, whether you say Christ goeth before me to make the crooked places straight, or whether you say I go before me to make the crooked places straight, it makes no difference. It's only a matter of terminology. You are recognizing your divine sonship. And this is what is necessary. Ye are the temple of God, but you must know this truth, and this truth will make you free. You must pray without ceasing. You must know this truth without ceasing. You can't wait for a problem to arise. You can't wait for just 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock at night. You can start that way as a young student, but you can't remain that way for long. It must be a praying without ceasing. It must be a knowing the truth. It must be abiding in these Bible passages, Bible promises, Bible statements. There must be a conscious dwelling in the realization of my true identity and the recognition that, of course, there is a natural man of me hovering about. There is. It'll tempt us to be sick. It'll tempt us to sin. It'll tempt us to lose our temper. It'll tempt us to do a lot of things, and some of them we'll even fall for. But be assured of this, that that natural man will have less and less place in our life as we abide more and more in the true nature of our identity, or the nature of our true identity. Know who you are and live with it silently, secretly. And then you will know that I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, because I am yourself. You can never be divided from yourself. You can never be separated from yourself. And yourself is spiritual divine sonship. Thank you.